Chapter 1. I always called him Sensei, and so I shall do in these pages, rather than reveal his name. It is not that I wish to shield him from public scrutiny, simply that it feels more natural. Sensei springs to my lips whenever I summon memories of this man, and I write of him now with the same reverence and respect. It would also feel wrong to use some conventional initial to substitute for his name and thereby distance him. I first met Sensei in Kamakura in the days when I was still a young student. A friend had gone there during summer vacation for sea bathing and urged me to join him, so I set about organizing enough money to cover the trip. This took me 2 or 3 days. Less than 3 days after I arrived, my friend received a sudden telegram from home demanding that he return. His mother was ill, it seemed. He did not believe it. For some time his parents had been trying to force him into an unwanted marriage. By present-day standards he was far too young for marriage, and besides he did not care for the girl in question. That was why he had chosen not to return home for the vacation, as he normally would have, but to go off to a local seaside resort to enjoy himself. He showed me the telegram and asked what I thought he should do. I did not know what to advise. But if his mother really was ill, he clearly should go home, so in the end he decided to leave. Having come to Kamakura to be with my friend, I now found myself alone. I could stay or go as I pleased, since some time still remained before classes began again, so I decided to stay where I was for the moment. My friend, who was from a prosperous family in the Chikoku region, did not lack for money. But he was a student, and young, so in fact his standard of living was actually much like my own, and I was spared the trouble of having to find a cheaper inn for myself after he left. The inn he had chosen was somewhere in an out-of-the-way district of Kamakura. To get to any of the fashionable spots, the billiard rooms and ice cream parlors and such things, I had to take a lengthy walk through the rice fields. A rickshaw ride would cost me a full 20 sen. Still, a number of new summer houses stood in the area, and it was right next to the beach, making it wonderfully handy for sea bathing. Each day I went down to the shore for a swim, making my way among soot-blackened old thatched country houses. An astonishing number of men and women always thronged the beach, city folk down from Tokyo to escape the summer heat. Sometimes the crowd was so thick that the water was a tightly packed mass of black heads, as in some public bathhouse. Knowing no one, I enjoyed my time alone amid this merry scene, lying on the sand and leaping about up to my knees in the waves. It was here in this throng of people that I first came upon Sensei. In those days 2 little stores on the beach provided drinks and changing rooms, and for no particular reason I took to frequenting one of them. Unlike the owners of the grand summer houses in the Hayes area, we users of this beach had no private bathing huts, so communal changing rooms were Chapter 50. My father's condition deteriorated to the point where the fatal blow seemed imminent, only to hover there precariously. Each night the family would go to sleep feeling that tomorrow might well be the day of reckoning. He was completely free of the kind of pain that is a torture for others to witness. In this way at least, he was easy to nurse. We took care to ensure that someone was always taking his turn by the bedside, but the rest of us could usually settle down to sleep at a reasonable hour. Once when I couldn't get to sleep for some reason, I mistakenly thought I heard my father faintly groaning. I slipped out of bed in the middle of the night and went to check on him. That evening it was my mother's turn to stay up with him. I found her asleep beside him, her head resting on her crooked arm. My father lay peacefully at her side, like one laid gently down inside a deep sleep. I tiptoed back to bed again. I shared a bed under a mosquito net with my brother, while my sister's husband, who was treated more as a guest, slept alone in a separate room. Poor Seiki, my brother said. Seiki was our brother-in-law's family name. He's caught here day after day, when he ought to be getting back. But he can't really be so busy, if he can stay on like this, I said. You're the one who must be finding it difficult to stay so long. There's no help for it, is there? This isn't an everyday matter, after all. So our conversation went as we lay there side by side. My brother believed, as did I, that our father was doomed, and this being so, we longed for it all to be over. Essentially we were awaiting our father's death, but we were reluctant to express it that way. Yet each of us was well aware of what the other was thinking. He seems to be still hoping he'll recover, doesn't he? My brother remarked. This idea was not entirely unjustified. When neighbors came to visit him, my father always insisted on seeing them. He would then proceed to apologize that he hadn't been able to invite them to my graduation celebration, sometimes adding that he'd make amends once he was better. It's a good thing your celebration party was cancelled, you know, my brother remarked to me. Mine was dreadful, remember? His words prodded my memory, and I smiled wryly, thinking of that event's alcohol-inflamed disorder. I had painful memories of the way my father had gone around forcing food and drink on everyone. We 2 brothers were not terribly close. When we were little, we had fought a lot, and being the younger, I was constantly reduced to tears. In school our different choices of field of study clearly reflected our different characters. While I was at the university, and especially once I had come in contact with Sensei, I came to look on my distant brother as rather an animal. We had not met for a long time and lived very far apart, so both time and distance separated us. But circumstances had at last brought us together again, and a brotherly affection sprang up naturally between us. The nature of the situation played a large part. There at the bedside of our dying father, my brother and I were reconciled. "What do you plan to do now?" my brother asked me. I responded with a question of a completely different order. Chapter 55. I have had 2 or 3 letters from you this summer. I seem to remember that in the second or third you asked my aid in securing a suitable position. When I read this, I had the impulse to help in some way. At the very least I should have replied, and I felt bad that I did not. But I must confess that I made absolutely no effort in response to your request. Living, as you know, not so much in a confined social milieu as entirely cut off from the social world, I simply had no means of doing so. But this was not my real problem. Truth to tell, I was just then struggling with the question of what to do about myself. Should I continue as I was, like a walking mummy doomed to remain in the human world, but whenever I whispered in my heart this a horror overcame me. I was like a man who rushes to the edge of a cliff and suddenly finds himself gazing down into a bottomless chasm. I was a coward, suffering precisely the agony that all cowards suffer. Sorry as I am to admit it, the simple truth is that your existence was the last thing on my mind. Indeed, to put it bluntly, the question of your work, of how you should earn a living, was utterly meaningless to me. I didn't care. It was the least of my problems. I left your letter in the letter rack, folded my arms, and returned to my thoughts. Far from feeling sympathetic, I did no more than cast a bitter glance your way, a fellow from a family with a decent amount of property, only just graduated, and already making a fuss about a job. I confess this to you now by way of explanation for my unforgivable failure to respond. I am not being intentionally rude to stir your anger. I believe that as you read on, you will fully understand. At all events, I neglected to reply as I should have done, and I now apologize for my remissness. Afterward I sent you a telegram. In truth, I rather wanted to see you just then. I wanted to tell you the story of my past, as you had asked. When you replied that you could not come to Tokyo, I sat for a long time gazing at the telegram in disappointment. You must have felt that your brief response was not enough, for you then wrote me that long letter, from which I understood the circumstances that held you at home. I have no cause to consider you rude. How could you have left your dear sick father back at home in Come? Chapter 59. The first time I returned from Tokyo for the summer holidays, my uncle and aunt had moved into the house where I had suffered through the death of my parents, and were now ensconced there. This had been decided on before I left for Tokyo. It was the only thing to be done, since I was the only remaining person in our family, and no longer living there myself. My uncle, I recall, was involved with a number of companies in the town at the time. When we were discussing how to arrange things so that I would be free to go to Tokyo, he had remarked half-jokingly that it would actually be more convenient for him to stay in his home in town to attend to his work, rather than move out to this house 5 miles away. My family home was an old and important one in the area, fairly well known to the local people. As you probably know, to demolish or sell an old house with a history when there is an heir who could live there is a serious matter. Nowadays I would not let such things bother me, but I was still essentially a child. The problem of leaving the house empty while I was living in Tokyo was a great worry for me. My uncle grudgingly agreed to move into the empty house that now belonged to me, but he insisted he would need to keep his house in town and move to and fro between the two as the need arose. I was, of course, in no position to object. I was happy to accept any conditions as long as I could get to Tokyo. Child that I still was, I looked back with a warm nostalgia on the house I had now left. I felt about it as a traveler feels about the home to which he will one day return. For all that I had longed to leave it for Tokyo, I had a strong compulsion to go back there when the summer holidays came, and I often had dreams of the house I would return to after the hard study and fun of the term were over. I do not know just how my uncle divided his time between the two places while I was away, but when I arrived in the summer, the whole family was gathered there under a single roof. I imagined that the children were there for the holidays, although they would have lived in town for most of the year to attend school. Everyone was delighted to see me, and I was happy to find the house so much livelier and more cheerful than it had been in my parents' day. My uncle moved his eldest son out of the room that had been mine so that I could occupy it again. There were quite enough rooms to go around, and at first I demurred, saying I didn't mind where I slept. But he would not hear of it. "It's your house," he told me. Recollections of my dead mother and father were all that disturbed the pleasure of the summer I spent with my uncle's family before returning to Tokyo. But one event did cast a faint shadow across my heart. Although I had barely begun my college life, my uncle and aunt both urged me to consider marrying. They must have repeated it 3 or 4 times. The first time they brought up the subject, it was so unexpected that I was no more than taken aback. The second time I made my refusal clear. When they brought it up a third time, I was forced to ask their reasons for pressing marriage on me in this way. Their answer was brief and straightforward. They simply wanted me to make an early marriage so that I could come back to live in the house and become my father's heir. Personally, all I wanted to do was to come back during vacations. I was familiar enough with country ways to understand this talk of succeeding my father and the consequent need for a wife, of course, and I was not even really against the idea. But I had only just gone to Tokyo to pursue my studies, and to me it was all in some distant future landscape, seen as it were through a telescope. I left the house without consenting to my uncle's wish. Chapter 60. I forgot all about this talk of marriage. None of the young fellows around me, after all, had the air of responsible householders, all seemed their own men, individual and free of constraints. If I had penetrated below the apparent happiness, I might have found some whom family circumstance had already forced to marry, but I was too young and innocent to be aware of such things then. Besides, anyone who found himself in that kind of situation would have kept it to himself as far as possible, considering it private and quite irrelevant to a student's life. I now realize that I was already in this category myself, but in my innocence I continued to pursue my studies contentedly. At the end of the school year I once more packed my trunk and returned to the home that held my parents' graves. Once again I found my uncle and aunt and their children in the house where my parents used to live. Nothing had changed. I breathed again the familiar scent of my home, a scent still filled with nostalgic memories. Needless to say, I also welcomed being back there as a relief from the monotony of the year's studies. But even as I breathed this scent, so redolent of the air I had grown up in, my uncle suddenly thrust the question of marriage under my nose again. He repeated his line from my previous visit, giving the same reason as before. But while the summer before he had had no particular woman in mind, this time I was disconcerted to learn that a prospective wife had been selected for me. She was my uncle's daughter, in other words, my own cousin. Marrying her would suit both of us, he maintained, and furthermore my father had actually spoken of it before he died. Put this way, I supposed it was a suitable enough arrangement, and I easily accepted that my father could have had that conversation with my uncle. I was certainly rather surprised, since this was the first time I had heard of it. My uncle's request seemed perfectly reasonable and comprehensible, however. No doubt I should not have taken his words on faith. But what primarily concerned me was that I felt quite indifferent to this younger daughter of my uncle. We'd been close ever since childhood, when I had been a constant visitor at my uncle's house in town, not only on day visits but also as an overnight guest. As you will know, romantic love never develops between siblings. I may be stretching the interpretation of this well-known fact, but it seems to me that between any male and female who have been close and in continual contact, such great intimacy rules out the fresh response necessary to stimulate feelings of romantic love. Just as you can only really smell incense in the first moments after it is lit, or taste wine in that instant of the first sip, the impulse of love springs from a single, perilous moment in time, I feel. If this moment slips casually by unnoticed, intimacy may grow as the two become accustomed to each other, but the impulse to romantic love will be numbed. And so, consider it as I might, I could not find it in me to marry my cousin. My uncle said that if I wanted, I could put off the marriage until after my graduation. But, he went on, we should seize the day, as the saying goes, and perform the basic exchange of marriage cuts as soon as possible. The question of when it should happen was of no concern to me, since I felt no interest in the bride. I reiterated my refusal. My uncle looked unsatisfied, and my cousin wept. Hers were not tears of regret that she could not take her place beside me, they were the tears of a humiliated woman who has sought marriage and been rejected. I knew perfectly well that she loved me as little as I loved her. I went back to Tokyo. Chapter 61. A year later, at the beginning of the following summer, I went back home for the third time. As always, I couldn't wait to finish final exams and get out of Tokyo, which indicates how much I longed for my home. I am sure you know this well too, the very color of the air in the place I was born was different. The smell of the earth was special, redolent with memories of my parents. To spend July and August nestled back inside that world, motionless as a snake in its hole, filled me with warm pleasure. My innocent and uncomplicated mind felt no need to bother itself much over the problem of the proposed marriage to my cousin. If you didn't want to do something, you simply said no, I believed, and there would be no further repercussions. So although I had not submitted to my uncle's will, I remained unperturbed. I returned home in my usual high spirits, after a year spent unworried by the question. But when I got home, I discovered that my uncle's attitude had changed. He did not embrace me with a welcoming smile as he had before. For the first 4 or 5 days I remained unaware of the change. My loving upbringing had not prepared me even to recognize coldness. Finally, however, some chance event finally brought it to my notice. I then realized in bewilderment that it was not only my uncle who had changed, but also my aunt. My cousin was also odd, and so was my uncle's son, who had earlier written a friendly letter asking me to investigate the industrial college he intended to enter in Tokyo once he had graduated from middle school. Being who I am, I puzzled over this development. Why had my feelings changed? Or rather, why had theirs changed? Then it occurred to me that perhaps my dead parents had suddenly cleansed my dulled eyes and given me a clear vision of the world. Deep inside, you see, I felt that my parents continued to love me as in life. Even though I was already well acquainted with the real world by then, The strong superstitious beliefs of my ancestors coursed deep in my blood. No doubt they still do. I climbed the nearby hill alone and knelt before my parents' graves, half in mourning and half in gratitude. I prayed to them to watch over me, feeling as I prayed that my future happiness lay in those hands buried beneath the cold stone. You may laugh, and no doubt I deserve it. But that is who I was. In a flash, my whole world changed. This was not, mind you, my first such experience. When I was 16 or 17, my sudden discovery of beauty in the world had stunned me. Many times I rubbed my eyes in sheer disbelief, and doubted my own eyes, while my heart exclaimed, "Ah, how beautiful." At that age boys and girls alike attain what is commonly called sensuality. In this new state, I was for the first time able to see women as representative of the beauty that the world contains. My eyes, until then quite blind to this beauty in the opposite sex, sprang open, and from that moment my universe was transformed. It was with precisely the same sort of shock that I became conscious of the change in my uncle's attitude to me. I was stunned by the realization, which came upon me abruptly, without any premonition. Suddenly, my uncle and his family seemed to me completely different creatures. I was haunted by the feeling that I must make some move, or who knew what might befall me. Chapter 62. I decided that I owed it to my dead parents to obtain a detailed understanding of the house and property that I had until then left for my uncle to look after. My uncle presented himself as living a hectic life. He bustled endlessly between the townhouse and the country estate, spending perhaps 1 and 3 nights in town. Forever on the move, he made a great fuss about how busy he was. I had always taken him at his word, although I sometimes cynically suspected that he was following the modern fashion to appear busy. But now, with my newfound desire to find a time to talk through the question of property, I could only interpret this endless rush as an excuse to avoid me. I never had a chance to pin him down. A friend from my middle school days told me that my uncle kept a mistress in town. Knowing the sort of man he was, I had no reason to doubt that he might have a mistress, but I had no memory of such talk while my father was alive, so the rumor startled me. The friend also passed on to me various other rumors that were circulating about my uncle. Among them was the story that his business had been generally thought to be going under, but in the last 2 or 3 years it had suddenly revived and prospered. This tale heightened my own suspicions. I finally managed to open negotiations with my uncle. Perhaps the word negotiations is a little harsh, but as we talked, the tenor of our relations sank to such a low level that only this word can express what took place. My uncle persisted in treating me as a child, while I viewed him through the jaundiced eyes of suspicion. Under these circumstances, the chances of a peaceful resolution were nil. Unfortunately, my need to press on with my story prevents me from describing the details of those negotiations for you. To tell the truth, there is another, more important matter I have yet to speak of, one that I have with difficulty restrained my pen from writing all this time. I have lost forever the chance to talk quietly with you, and now I am also forced to omit some of what I would like to write, not only because I lack the skill to express myself on the page, but also because time is precious to me. You may remember I once said to you that no one is inherently bad by nature, and I warned you to be careful because most honest folk will suddenly turn bad when circumstances prompt it. Chapter 64. With my new financial freedom, I began to play with the idea of quitting my noisy boarding house and finding myself a house to live in. I soon realized, however, that this would entail the bother of buying the necessary furniture, and employing a servant to run the household, one who was honest, so that I could leave the house unattended without worrying. One way or another, I could see that it would be no easy matter to achieve my plan. At any rate I should look around for a suitable house, I thought, and with this aim at the back of my mind one day I happened to go west down the slope of Hong Hill, and climb Koishikawa toward Denzin Temple Point 1. That area has changed completely since the streetcar line went in. Back then the earthen wall of the arsenal was on the left, and on the right was a large expanse of grassy vacant land, something between a hillside and an open field. I stood in the grass and gazed absent-mindedly at the bluff before me. The scenery there is still quite good, but in those days that western side was far lovelier. Just to see the deep, rich green of all that foliage soothed the heart. It suddenly occurred to me to wonder if there might not be a suitable house somewhere nearby. I immediately crossed the grassy expanse and set off north along a narrow lane. Today it is not a particularly good area, and even back then the houses were fairly ramshackle and run down. I wandered around, ducking down lanes and into side alleys. Finally I asked a cake seller if she knew of any little house for rent in the area. She said, and cocked her head for a moment or two. I can't think of anything offhand. Seeing that she apparently had nothing to suggest, I gave up hope and was just turning for home when she asked, "Would you lodge with a family?" That set me thinking. Taking private lodgings in someone's home would save me a lot of the trouble involved in owning my own house. I sat down at her stall and asked her to tell me the details. It was the house of a military man, or rather of his surviving family. The cake seller thought he had probably died in the Sino-Japanese War. 2 until about a year before. The family had been living near the officers' academy in Ichigaya, but the place was too grand, with stables and outbuildings, and too big for the family, so they had sold it and moved to this area. Apparently, however, they felt lonely here, just the two of them, and had asked her if she knew of a suitable lodger. She told me the household consisted solely of the widow, her daughter, and a maid. It sounded perfect for me, being so quiet and secluded, but I feared that if I were to turn up suddenly and offer myself, an unknown student, the widow might turn me down. Perhaps I should give up the idea then and there, I thought. But I was dressed quite respectably for a student, and besides, I was wearing my school cap. You will probably scoff at the idea that this was important. But in those days, unlike today, students had quite a good reputation, and my square cap invested me with a certain confidence. And so I followed the cake seller's directions and called in at the house unannounced. Introducing myself to the widow, I explained the purpose of my visit. She asked me numerous questions about my background, my score, and my studies. Something in my answers must have reassured her, for she said right away that I could move in whenever I wanted. I admired her thoroughly upright, plain-spoken air, a typical officer's wife, I decided. On the other hand, she also rather surprised me. Why should a woman of such apparent strength of character feel lonely? Chapter 66. By the time I left home, I was already thoroughly disenchanted with the world. My conviction that others could not be trusted had, you might say, penetrated me to the marrow. My despised uncle and aunt and relatives seemed representative of the whole of humanity. Even on the train I found myself glancing warily at my neighbors, and when someone occasionally spoke to me, my mistrust only deepened. I was sunk in depression. At times I felt a suffocating pressure, as if I had swallowed lead. Yet at the same time every nerve was on edge. This state of mind was largely what had prompted my decision to leave the noisy boarding house, I think. True, my financial security meant I could consider living in a place of my own, but my earlier self would never have thought of going to such bother, no matter how much money might be in my pocket. For some time after my move to Koishikawa, I continued in a highly strung state. I kept glancing furtively about, so much so that I unnerved even myself. Although my mind and eyes were abnormally active, however, my tongue grew less and less inclined to speak. I sat silently at my desk, observing those around me like a cat. Sometimes my keen awareness of them was so intense it shamed me to think of it. All that distinguished me from a thief was that I was stealing nothing, I thought in self-disgust. You must find all this most peculiar. How on earth did I have energy to spare to feel attracted to Osum, to delight in gazing at her clumsy flower arrangements or listen with joy to her inept playing? I can only answer that these were the facts, and as such I must lay them before you. I will leave it up to your clever mind to analyze them, and simply add one thing. I distrusted the human race where money was concerned, but not yet in the realm of love. So despite the obvious contradiction, both states of mind happily coexisted inside me. I always called the widow by the polite title of Okusan, so I shall do the same here. Okusan apparently considered me a quiet, well-behaved person, and she was full of praise for my studious habits. She made no mention of the uneasy glances or the troubled, suspicious air. Perhaps she simply did not notice it, or maybe she was too polite to speak of it. At any event, it never seemed to bother her. Once she even admiringly told me I had a generous heart. I was honest enough to blushingly deny this, but she insisted. You only say that because you're not aware of it yourself, she said earnestly. The fact is, she had not originally planned on having a student as a boarder. When she had asked around the neighborhood if anyone knew of a lodger, she had thought in terms of a government official or the like. I imagined she was envisaging some underpaid fellow who couldn't afford a place of his own. Compared with her impoverished imaginary lodger, I struck her as far more generous in my ways. I guess I was in fact more liberal with my money than someone in more straitened circumstances would have been. But this was a product of circumstance rather than any natural generosity, so it was hardly an indication of what kind of person I was. In her woman's way, however, Okusan did her best to view my liberality with money as an expression of my general character. Chapter 68. I would sigh with relief after Osun left my room, but I also felt a certain dissatisfaction and regret. Perhaps there was something girlish in me. I imagine a modern youth such as you would certainly think so. But in those days this was the way most of us were. Okusan rarely left the house, and on the few occasions when she did, she never left me alone with her daughter. I can't judge whether this was intentional. It may be out of place for me to say this, but after careful observation I could only conclude that Okusan wanted to bring us closer, yet at other times she seemed secretly guarded. I had never been in such a situation, and it often made me uncomfortable. I needed Okusan to make her position clear. Rationally speaking, her attitudes were clearly contradictory, but with the memory of my uncle's deceitfulness still so fresh, I could not repress another suspicion that one of her two conflicting attitudes must be fake. I was at a loss to decide which was the real one, and I could make no sense of why she behaved so strangely. At times I chose simply to lay the fault entirely at the door of womanhood itself. When it comes down to it, I told myself, she's acting this way because she's a woman, and women are stupid. Whenever my cogitations arrived at a dead end, This answer was the one I reached for. Yet although I despised women, I could not find it in me to despise Osun. Faced with her, my theorizing lost its power. I felt for her a love that was close to pious faith. You may find it odd that I use a specifically religious word to describe my feelings for a young woman, but real love, I firmly believe, is not so different from the religious impulse. Whenever I saw her face, I felt that I myself had become beautiful. At the mere thought of her, I felt elevated by contact with her nobility. If this strange phenomenon we call love can be said to have two poles, the higher of which is a sense of holiness and the baser the impulse of sexual desire, this love of mine was undoubtedly in the grip of love's higher realm. Being human, of course, I could not leave my fleshly self behind, yet the eyes that beheld her, the hearts that treasured thoughts of her, knew nothing of the reek of the physical. My love for the daughter grew as my antipathy toward the mother increased, and so the relationship among the three of us ceased to be the simple thing it had once been. This change was largely internal, mind you. On the surface all was the same. Then some little thing made me begin to wonder if I had misunderstood Okusun. I now revised my idea that one of her two contradictory attitudes toward me and her daughter must be false. They did not inhabit. Chapter 71. I spent my money on nothing but books. Okusun told me I should get some clothes, and it was true. All I had were the country-woven cotton robes that had been made for me back home. Students in those days never wore anything with silk in it. One of my friends, who came from a wealthy family of Yokohama merchants who did things extravagantly, was once sent an underrobe of fine silk. We all laughed at it. He produced all sorts of shamefaced excuses and tossed it unworn into his trunk, till we gathered around one day and bullied him into wearing it. Unfortunately, the thing became infested with lice. This was a lucky break for my friend, who bundled it up and carried it off on one of his walks, where he threw it into the large ditch in Nezu. I was with him, and I remember standing on the bridge laughing as I watched him. It never crossed my mind that this was a wasteful thing to do. I must have been quite grown up by then, but I still had not come to understand the need for a set of good clothes. I had the odd idea that I had no need to bother about clothes until I graduated and grew an adult mustache. So my response to Okusun was that I only needed books. Knowing just how many I bought, she asked whether I read them all. I was stuck for an answer. Some were dictionaries, but there were quite a few others that I should have read but whose pages were not even cut. Books or clothing, I realized then it made no difference if the thing went unused. Besides, I wanted to buy Osun an obi or some fabric that took her fancy, on the pretext of repaying them for all the kindness I had received. I therefore relented and asked Okusun to purchase the necessary things for me. She was not prepared to go alone. I must accompany her, she told me, and furthermore her daughter must come too. We students were brought up in a different world from today, remember, and it was not the custom in those days to go around in a girl's company. Being still very much a slave to convention, I was hesitant, but I finally gathered up my courage and we all set off together. Osun was dressed up for the occasion. She had whitened her naturally pale face with copious amounts of powder, and the effect was striking. Passers-by stared at her. Then their eyes would stray to my face as I walked beside her, which I found disconcerting. We went to Nihonbashi and bought all we... Chapter 72. When I got home, I told this story to Okusun and Osun. Okusun laughed, then looked me in the eye and added, "That must have been awkward for you." I wondered then whether this was how a woman induces a man to talk. Her look certainly gave me reason to think so. Perhaps I should have asked for Osun's hand then and there, but my heart was by now deeply ingrained with distrust. I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped and deliberately shifted the direction of the conversation elsewhere. Carefully avoiding the crucial subject of my own feelings, I probed Okusun on her intentions for her daughter's marriage. She told me frankly that there had already been 2 or 3 proposals, but as her daughter was still a young schoolgirl, there was no hurry. Though she did not say as much, she clearly set great store by her daughter's good looks. She even remarked in passing that a suitable husband could be found anytime they wished. But as her daughter was an only child, she said, she was not inclined to send her off with just anyone. I got the impression that she was of 2 minds about whether to adopt a son-in-law as a member of their own household, or let her daughter marry out as a bride. 1. I felt I was gaining quite a lot of information as I listened. Effectively, however, I had forfeited my own chance to speak. I couldn't say a word on my own behalf now. At an appropriate point I broke off the conversation and returned to my room. Osun, who had been sitting with us laughing and protesting at my tale, by this time had retreated to a corner with her back turned. As I stood to leave, I turned and saw her there. It is impossible to read the heart of someone who is looking away, and I couldn't guess what she might have been thinking as she listened. She was sitting beside the half-open closet and had taken something from it and laid it on her lap. She now appeared to be gazing intently down at it. In a corner of the open closet, I caught sight of the fabric I had bought her 2 days before. My own new robe, I saw, lay folded there with hers. As I was standing wordlessly to leave, Okusun suddenly grew serious. "What's your opinion?" she asked. Confused by the unexpected question, I had to ask what she meant. She wanted to know, she explained, whether I thought an early marriage was a good idea. I said I thought it wise to take things slowly. I think so too, she replied. It was at this point in the relationship among the three of us that another man entered the picture, one whose arrival in the household crucially affected my fate. If he had not crossed my path, I doubt that I would need to write this long letter to you now. It was as if I stood there oblivious as the devil brushed by me, unaware that he cast a shadow upon me that would darken my whole life. It was I who brought this man into the house, I must confess. Naturally, I needed Okusun's consent, so I told her his story and asked if he could move in with me. She advised against it but had no convincing argument to offer. For my part, I could see every reason why I must bring him into the household, and so I persisted in following my own judgment and did what I believed was right. Chapter 73. I will call this friend of mine K. We had been friends since childhood. As you will no doubt realize from this, our native place was a bond between us. K was the son of a Pure Land Buddhist priest, but not the eldest son and heir, I should add, which is how he came to be adopted by a doctor's family. The Hungan subsect had a very powerful presence in my home district, and its priests were better off than others. If the priest had a daughter of marriageable age, for instance, one of his parishioners would help to find her a suitable match, and the wedding expenses would of course not come out of his own pocket. Pure Land temple families were thus generally quite wealthy. K's home temple was a prosperous one. Even so, the family may not have had the funds to send him to Tokyo for his education. Did they decide to have him adopted into the other family because the other family had the means to educate him? I have no way of knowing. I only know that the doctor's family adopted him while we were still middle school students. I still remember the surprise I felt when the teacher called the roll one day and I realized K's name had suddenly changed. His new family was also fairly wealthy, and they paid for him to go to Tokyo for his studies. I left before he did, but he moved into the same dormitory when he arrived. K and I shared a room. In those days it was common for 2 or 3 students to study and sleep together in the one room. We lived huddled together like wild animals trapped in a cage, hugging each other and glaring out at the world. Tokyo and its inhabitants frightened us both. There in our little room, however, we spoke with contempt of the world at large. But we were in earnest, and determined one day to become great. K's willpower was particularly strong. Son of a temple family that he was in the habit of talking in terms of the Buddhist concept of dedicated self-discipline, and his behavior certainly seemed to me to epitomize this ideal. In my heart, I stood in awe of him. Ever since our middle school days, K had bewildered me with difficult discussions on religion and philosophy. I do not know whether his father had inspired this interest, or whether the atmosphere peculiar to temple buildings had infected him as a child. In any event, K seemed to me far more monkish than the average monk. His adoptive family had sent him to Tokyo to study medicine. In his stubborn way, however, he had decided before he arrived that he would not become a doctor. I reproached him, pointing out that he was in effect deceiving his adoptive parents, and he brashly agreed that he was. Such deception did not bother him, he said, since it was in the cause of his chosen path. I doubt if even he understood precisely what he meant by this phrase. I certainly had no idea. But we were young, and this vague abstraction had for us a hallowed ring. Comprehension was beside the point. I could not but admire these lofty sentiments that governed and impelled him. I accepted his argument. I do not know how important my agreement may have been for K, but he would surely have gone his way, stubbornly, regardless of any protest I made. Child though I still was, however, I was prepared to accept that by going along with him, I would bear some responsibility if problems ever arose. Even if I could not quite summon such resolve at the time, nevertheless I spoke my words of encouragement to him, firm in the belief that if in later life I ever had cause to look back on this moment, I would properly acknowledge the degree of responsibility I bore. Chapter 75. His adoptive father was enraged when he read K's letter and immediately sent off a forceful reply to the effect that he could not finance the education of a scoundrel who had so deceived his parents. K showed me the letter. He then showed me the one he had received from his own family, which condemned him in equally strong terms. No doubt an added sense of failed obligation to the other family reinforced their decision to refuse to support him. K was faced with the dilemma of whether to return to his own family or consent to compromise with his adoptive parents to stay on their family register. His immediate problem, however, was how to come up with the money he needed to stay at college. I asked if he had found a solution, and he replied that he was thinking of taking work teaching at an evening school. Times were far easier back then. It was not as difficult as you might think to find part-time work of this sort. I thought it would see him through very well. But I also bore responsibility in the matter. I had been the one to agree with his decision to ignore his adoptive family's plans for him and tread a path of his own choosing, and I could not now stand idly by. I immediately offered K financial assistance. He rejected it absolutely. Given who he was, no doubt financial independence gave him far greater satisfaction than the prospect of living under a friend's protection. Now that he was a university student, he declared, He must be man enough to stand on his own 2 feet. I was not prepared to hurt K's feelings for the sake of satisfying my own sense of responsibility, so I let him have his way and withdrew my offer of a helping hand. K soon found the kind of job he hoped for, but as you can well imagine for someone with his temperament, he chafed at the amount of precious time it consumed. Still, he pushed fiercely on with his studies, never slackening under the added burden. I worried about his health. Iron-willed, he laughed me off and paid no heed to my warnings. Meanwhile, his relations with his adoptive family were growing increasingly difficult. His lack of time meant that he no longer had a chance to talk with me as he used to, so I never learned the details, but I was aware that more and more stood in the way of a resolution. I also knew that someone had stepped in and attempted to mediate. This person wrote to K encouraging him to return, but he refused, having made up his mind that it was absolutely out of the question. This obstinacy, or so it would have struck the other party, although he claimed that it was impossible for him to leave during the school term, seemed to exacerbate the situation. Not only was K hurting the feelings of his adoptive family, he was fueling the ire of his real family as well. Worried, I wrote a letter that attempted to soothe the situation, but it was too late by now for it to have any effect. My letter sank without a word of response. I too grew angry. The situation had always encouraged my sympathy with K, but now I was inclined to take his side regardless of the rights and wrongs of the matter. Finally, K decided to officially return to his original family's register, which meant that they would have to repay the school fees paid by the other party. His own family, however, responded by washing their hands of him. To use an outmoded expression, they, as it were, disowned him. Perhaps it was not quite so radical as that, but that was how he understood it. K had no mother, and certain aspects of his character were perhaps the result of his being brought up by a stepmother. If his mother had not died, I feel, this distance between him and his family might never have arisen. His father, of course, was a priest, but his sternness in matters of Confucian moral obligation suggests that there was a lot of the samurai in him. Chapter 77. From the entrance hall the only access to my room was through a little format room that lay between. This anteroom, in effect a passageway, was virtually useless for practical purposes. This is where I put K. At first I recreated our previous arrangement, placing 2 desks side by side in my own larger room, with the idea that we would also share the small one. But K chose to make the small room exclusively his, declaring that he was happier alone no matter how cramped the space. As I mentioned, Okusun initially opposed my plan to bring K in at all. In an ordinary lodging house, she agreed, it made sense for 2 to share, and still better 3, but she wasn't doing this as a business, she said, and urged me to reconsider. I told her K would be no trouble. Even so, she replied, she did not like the idea of housing someone she didn't know. In that case, I pointed out, she should have objected to me as well. But she countered with the statement that she had known and trusted me from the beginning. I smiled wryly. At this point she changed her tactics. Bringing in someone like K, she said, would be bad for me. When I asked why, it was her turn to smile. To tell the truth, there was no real necessity for me to live with K. But if I had tried to give him a monthly cash allowance, I felt sure he would have been very reluctant to accept it. He was a fiercely independent man. Better to let him live with me, while I secretly gave Okusun money enough to feed us both. Nevertheless, I had no desire to reveal K's dire financial situation to her. I did, however, talk about his precarious state of health. If left to himself, I told her, he would only grow more perverse and eccentric. I went on to describe his strained relations with his adoptive parents and his severance from his original family. By attempting to help him, I said, I was grasping a drowning man, desperate to infuse in him my own living heat. I begged Okusun and Osun to help by warmly accepting him. Okusun finally relented. K knew nothing of this discussion, and I was satisfied that he remained ignorant. When he came stolidly into the house with his bags, I greeted him with an innocent air. Okusun and Osun kindly helped him unpack and settle in. I was delighted, interpreting each generous gesture as an expression of their friendship for me. K, however, remained his usual door self. When I asked what he thought of his new home, he replied with a simple not bad. This brief response was a wild understatement, I felt. Until then he had been living in a dank, grimy little north-facing room, where the food was of a piece with the lodging. The move to my place was, as the old saying goes, from deep ravine to treetop high. It was partly sheer obstinacy that caused him to make light of the new place, but partly principle as well. His Buddhist upbringing had led him to think that paying attention to comfort in the basic needs of life was immoral. Brought up on tales of worthy monks and saints, he tended to consider flesh and spirit as separate entities. In fact, he may well have felt that to mortify the flesh was to exalt the soul. I decided to do my best not to argue, however. My aim was to apply a sunny warmth that would thaw his ice. Once the melted water began to trickle, I thought, he would sooner or later come to his senses. Chapter 78. Aware that under Okusun's kind treatment I myself had grown cheerful, I set about applying the same process to K. From my long acquaintance with him, I was all too aware of how different we were. But just as my own nerves had relaxed considerably since I'd moved into this household, I thought surely K's heart too would eventually grow calmer here. K's will was far steelier than mine. He studied twice as hard, and his mind was a good deal finer. I cannot speak for the later years, when we chose different areas of study, but in the middle and high school years, while we were classmates, he was consistently ahead of me. I used to feel, in fact, that K would best me in everything. But in convincing the stubborn K to move in with me, I was sure I was showing more good sense than he. He failed to understand the difference between patience and endurance, I felt. Please listen carefully now, I am saying this for your benefit. All our capacities, both physical and mental, require external stimuli for both their development and their destruction, and in either case these stimuli must be increased by slow degrees in order to be effective. But this gradual increase creates a very real danger that not only you yourself but those around you may fail to notice any problems that might develop. Doctors tell us that a man's stomach is a thoroughly rebellious creature, inclined to misbehave. If you feed it nothing but soft gruel, it will lose the power to digest anything heavier. So they instruct us to train it by feeding it all manner of foods. I don't think this is just a matter of getting it used to the variety, however. I interpret it to mean that the stomach's resilience gradually increases as the stimuli build up over time. Now imagine what would happen if the stomach instead grew steadily weaker under this regimen. K was in just such a situation. Now K was a greater man than I, but he failed to comprehend what was happening to him. He had decided that if he accustomed himself to hardship, then pain would sooner or later cease to register. The simple virtue of repetition of pain, he was sure, would bring him to a point where pain no longer affected him. In order to bring about a change of heart in K, it was this above all that I would have to clarify to him. But if I spelled it out, he would doubtless resist. He would bring up the example of those Stoics and saints of old in his defense, I knew, and I would then have to point out the difference between them and him. That would be worthwhile if he were of a mind to listen to me, but by nature, once an argument reached that point, he would stick to his guns. He would simply assert his own position more vehemently, and having once spoken he would feel obliged to follow through with action. In this respect he was quite intimidating. He was firm in his convictions. He would stride forward to meet his own destruction. In retrospect, the only thing that had any kind of grandeur was the resultant ruin of any hope of success. But there was certainly nothing run-of-the-mill about the process, at any rate. Knowing his temperament as I did, therefore, I couldn't utter a word. My sense that he was close to a nervous breakdown also made me hesitate. Even if I did manage to convince him, it would only agitate him further. I didn't mind quarreling, but I remembered how poorly I had withstood my own sense of isolation, and I couldn't bear to think of placing my friend in a similar situation, let alone exacerbating it. And so, even after bringing him into the house, I held back from voicing any real criticism. I decided simply to wait calmly to see what effect his new environment. Chapter 79. Behind his back, I asked Okusun and Osun to talk to K as much as possible, convinced that the silence of his previous life had been the cause of his ruin. It seemed clear to me that his heart had rusted like iron from disuse. Okusun laughed, remarking that he was rather curt and unapproachable, and Osun supported this by describing an encounter she had had with him. She'd asked him if his brazier was lit, and he had told her it wasn't. She offered to bring some charcoal, but he said he didn't need any. Wasn't he cold? She asked. He replied curtly that he was but didn't want a fire, and he refused to discuss the matter further. I couldn't simply dismiss her story with a rueful smile. I felt sorry for her, and that I must somehow make up for his rudeness. It was spring, of course, so he had had no real need for a warm fire in the brazier, but I could see that they had good reason to feel that he was difficult. I then did my best to use myself as a catalyst to bring them together. At every opportunity one encouraged Kay to spend time in the company of all three of us. When I was talking with him, I would call them in, or when I met up with them in one of the rooms, I'd invite him to join us. Naturally, Kay did not much care for this. Sometimes he would abruptly rise to his feet and walk out. At other times he ignored my calls. What's the point of all that idle chatter? He asked me. I just laughed, but I was well aware that he despised me for indulging in such frivolities. In some ways I doubtless deserved his scorn. His sights were fixed on far higher things than mine, I'll not deny it. But it is surely crippling to limp along, so out of step with the lofty gaze you insist on maintaining. My most important task, I felt, was somehow to make him more human. Filling his own head with the examples of impressive men was pointless, I decided, if it did not make him impressive himself. As a first step in the task of humanizing him, I would introduce him to the company of the opposite sex. Letting the fair winds of that gentle realm blow upon him would cleanse his blood of the rust that clogged it, I hoped. This approach gradually succeeded. The two elements, which had seemed at first so unlikely to merge, slowly came together until they were one. Chapter 80. Although Kay and I were in the same faculty, our fields of study were different, which meant that we came and went at different times. If I returned home early, I could simply pass through his empty room to reach my own. If he got home before I did, I always acknowledged him briefly before going on into my room. As I came through the door, Kay would glance up from his book and invariably say, "Just back, are you?" Sometimes I'd nod, and sometimes I'd simply give a grunt of assent. One day on my way home I had reason to stop in at Kanda, so I returned much later than usual. I hurried to the front gate and the lattice door clattered as I thrust it open. At that moment I heard Osune's voice. I was sure it came from K's room. The sitting room and Osune's room lay straight ahead through the entrance hall, while our 2 rooms were off to the left, and by now I had become attuned to deciphering the location of voices. Just as I hastened to close the lattice door, her voice ceased. While I was removing my shoes, I now wore fashionable Western lace-ups. Not a sound emerged from K's room. This struck me as odd. Had I been mistaken? But when I opened the sliding doors as usual to pass through K's room, I found the 2 of them sitting there. "Just back, are you?" said Kay, as always. "Welcome home," Osun said, remaining seated. For some reason, her straightforward greeting struck me as slightly stiff and formal. The tone had a somehow unnatural ring to my ears. "Where's Okusun?" I asked her. The question had no real significance, it was just that the house seemed unusually hushed. Okusun was out, and the maid had gone with her. Kay and Osun therefore were alone in the house. This puzzled me. I had lived there a long time by now, but Okusun had never left me alone in the house with Osun. Had she had urgent business to attend to? I inquired. Osun simply laughed. I disliked women who laugh in response that way. All young ladies do it, of course, but Osun had a tendency to laugh at silly things. When she saw my face, however, her usual expression quickly returned. "There had been nothing urgent," she replied. "Okusun had just gone out on a small errand." As a lodger, I had no right to press the matter further. I held my tongue. No sooner had I changed my clothes and settled down than Okusun and the maid returned. At length, the time came for us all to face one another over the evening meal. When I had first moved in as a lodger, they had treated me much like a guest, the maid serving dinner in my room, but this formality had broken down, and these days I was invited in to eat with the family. When Kay arrived, I insisted that he too be brought in for meals. In return, I donated to the household a light and elegant dining table of thin wood, with foldable legs. These days one can find tables like this in any household, but back then there were almost no homes where everyone sat around such a thing to eat. I had gone especially to a furniture shop in Okanamizu and ordered it made to my specifications. As we sat at the table that day, Okusun explained that the fish seller had failed to call at the usual hour, so she had had to go into town to buy our evening's food. Yes, I thought, that seems quite reasonable, given that she has guests to feed. Seeing my expression, Osun burst out laughing, but her mother's scolding quickly put an end to it. Chapter 81. A week later I again passed through the room when Osun and Kay were talking there together. This time she laughed as soon as she caught sight of me. I should have asked then and there what she found so humorous. But I simply went past them to my own room without speaking. Kay thus missed his chance to come out with his usual greeting. Soon I heard Osun open the sliding doors and go back to the sitting room. That evening at dinner she remarked that I was an odd person. Once again I failed to ask the reason. I did notice, however, that Okusun sent a hard stare in Osune's direction. After dinner Kay and I went for a walk. We went behind Denzin Temple and around the botanical gardens, emerging below Tomizaka. It was a long walk, but we spoke very little. Kay was temperamentally a man of even fewer words than I. I was not a great talker, but as we walked, I did my best to engage him in conversation. My main focus of concern was the family in whose house we were lodging. I asked him what he thought of Okusun and Osun. He was quite impossible to pin down on the subject, however. He not only avoided the point, but his responses were extremely brief. He seemed far more interested in the topic of his studies than in the 2 ladies. Our second-year exams were almost upon us, I admit, so from any normal point of view he was behaving much more typically than I. He launched into a disquisition on Swedenborg, one that made my uneducated mind reel. We both passed our exams successfully, and Okusun congratulated us on entering our final year. Her own daughter, her sole pride and joy, was soon to graduate as well. Kay remarked to me that girls emerged from their schooling knowing nothing. Clearly he chose to completely overlook Osune's extracurricular study of sewing, koto playing, and flower arranging. Laughing, I countered with my old argument that a woman's value did not lie in scholarly accomplishment. While he did not refute this statement outright, he did not seem willing to accept it either. That pleased me. I interpreted this casual dismissal of my ideas as an indication that his former scorn of women had not changed. Osun, whom I thought the embodiment of womanly excellence, was evidently still beneath his notice. In retrospect, I see that my jealousy of Kay was already showing its horns. I suggested that the 2 of us go away together somewhere during the summer vacation. He responded with apparent reluctance. It's true that he could not afford to go wherever he wanted, But on the other hand, nothing prevented him from accepting an invitation to travel with me. I asked why he didn't want to come. He replied that there was no real reason, he simply preferred to stay at home and read. When I contended that it would be healthier to spend the summer studying in some cooler place out of the city, he suggested I go on my own. I wasn't inclined to leave Kay there in the house alone. However, his growing intimacy with the two ladies was disturbing enough already. Needless to say, it was ridiculous for me to be so upset over a situation that I had gone out of my way to engineer in the first place. I was clearly being foolish. Okusan, tired of seeing us endlessly at cross purposes, stepped in to mediate. The result was that we decided the two of us would go off to the BSH Peninsula 2 together. Chapter 82. Kay seldom took trips, and I had never been to BSH, so we both disembarked at the boat's first port of call in complete ignorance of the place. Its name was Hota, I remember. I don't know what it might be like today, but in those days it was a dreadful little fishing village. For one thing, the whole place stank of fish. For another, when we tried sea bathing, the waves knocked us off our feet, and our arms and legs were soon covered in scratches and grazes from the fist-sized rocks that were forever tumbling around in the water with us. I soon had enough of the place. Kay, however, said not a word either for or against it. Judging from his expression at least, he seemed quite unperturbed, although he never emerged from a swim without a bruise or a cut. I finally persuaded him to leave Hota and move on to Tomiura. From there we went to Nako. All that part of the coast was a popular vacation place for students in those days, and we found beaches to our liking wherever we went. Kay and I often sat on a rock gazing out at the sea's colors, or at the underwater world at our feet. The water below us was beautifully crystal clear. In the transparent waves we could point out to each other the brilliant flashes of little fish, whose vivid reds and blues were more spectacular than anything to be seen in the fish markets. I frequently read while sitting on the rocks, while Kay spent most of his time sitting silently. Was he lost in thought, or gazing at the scene before him, or intent on some happy fantasy? I had no idea. Occasionally I glanced up and asked what he was doing. Nothing, he replied simply. I often thought how pleasant it would be if Osun, rather than Kay, was sitting there beside me. This was all very well, but I sometimes felt a stab of suspicion that Kay might be thinking the same thing. Whenever this occurred to me, I found I could no longer sit calmly reading. I rose abruptly to my feet and let out a great unrestrained yell. I couldn't dispel my pent-up feelings in a civilized manner, such as blandly declaiming some poem or song. All I could do was howl like a savage. Once, I grabbed Kay by the scruff of the neck and demanded to know what he would do if I tossed him into the sea. Kay remained motionless. Good idea. Go right ahead, he replied without turning. I quickly let go. The state of his nerves by now seemed to have considerably improved, while my own peace of mind had disintegrated. I observed his calm demeanor with envy, and with loathing, interpreting it as indifference to me. His serenity smacked of self-confidence, and not of a kind that it pleased me to see in him. My growing suspicions now demanded clarification of just what lay behind his self-assurance. Had his optimism about his chosen goals in life suddenly revived? If so, then we had no collision of interests. Indeed, it would have pleased me to think I had helped him on his way. But if his calm originated in his feelings for Osun, this I could not countenance. Strangely, he seemed oblivious to the signs that I myself loved her, though needless to say, I was anything but eager to alert him to my feelings. Quite simply, he was constitutionally insensitive to such things. Indeed, it had been in the faith that no such problems would arise that I had brought him into the house in the first place. Chapter 83. Summoning up my courage, I decided to confess to Kay what was in my heart. It was not the first time I had reached this decision. It had been my plan since before our trip together, in fact, but so far I had had the skill neither to seize an appropriate moment nor to create one. It strikes me now that the people I knew back then were all a bit peculiar. No one around me ever spoke about private matters of the heart. No doubt quite a few had nothing to confide, but even those who did kept silent. This must seem most peculiar to you, in the relative freedom of your present age. I will leave it to you to judge whether it was a lingering effect from the Confucianism of an earlier time or simply a form of shyness. On the face of it, Kay and I could say anything to each other. Questions of love and romance did occasionally come up, but our discussions around them always descended into abstract theory, and were in any case rare. For the most part, our conversations were confined to the subject of books and study, our future work, our aspirations, and self-improvement. As close as we were, it was difficult to break into these rigid, impersonal discussions with a personal confession. High-minded gravity was integral to our intimacy. I do not know how often I squirmed with impotent frustration at my inability to speak my heart as I had resolved to do. I longed to crack open some part of Kay's mind and soften him with a breath of gentler air. To your generation, this will seem quite absurd, but for me at the time it constituted a huge difficulty. I was the same coward on vacation as I had been back home. Though constantly alert for a chance to make my confession, I could find no way to break through Kay's determined aloofness. His heart might as well have been sealed off with a thick coating of hard black lacquer, it seemed to me, repelling every drop of the warm-blooded feeling that I was intent on pouring upon it. Sometimes, though, I found K's fiercely principled stance toward the world reassuring. Then I would regret ever doubting him and silently apologize for my suspicions. In this state of mind, I seemed a deeply inferior person and suddenly despised myself. But then the same old doubts would sweep back in and reassert themselves with renewed force. Since I deduced everything on the basis of suspicion, all my conclusions cast me in a disadvantageous light. It seemed to me that K was handsomer and more attractive to women than I, and that my fussiness made my personality less appealing to the opposite sex. His combination of firm manliness with something a little absurd also struck me as superior. Nor did I feel myself a match for him in scholarly ability, although of course our fields differed. With all his advantages so constantly before my eyes, any momentary relief from my fears soon reverted to the old anxieties. Observing my restlessness, K suggested that if I didn't like it here, we might as well go back to Tokyo, but as soon as he said this, I wanted to stay after all. What I actually wanted was to prevent him from going back himself, I think. We plodded on around the tip of the peninsula, miserably roasting in the painful rays of the hot sun and plagued by the notorious local habit of understating distances when we asked our way. I could no longer see any point in going on walking like this and said as much half-jokingly to K, "We're walking because we have legs," he replied. Whenever the heat grew too much for us, we took a dip in the sea wherever we happened to be. But when we set off again, the sun was just as fierce, and we grew limp with fatigue. Chapter 84. With all this walking, the heat and weariness inevitably took their toll on us. It's not that we were actually ill, rather it was the disturbing feeling that one's soul had suddenly moved on to inhabit someone else. Though I continued to talk to K as normal, I felt anything but normal. Both our intimacy and the antagonism I felt toward him took on a special quality that was peculiar to this journey. I suppose what I am saying is that, what with the heat, the sea, and the walking, we entered a different kind of relationship. We became for the moment like nothing so much as a couple of wandering peddlers who had fallen in with each other on the road. For all our talk, we never once broached the complex intellectual topics that we usually discussed. Eventually we arrived at one extraordinary event on our journey I will never forget. Before leaving the peninsula, we paused at Kominato to take a look at the famous sea bream inlet. It was many years ago, and besides, I was not particularly interested, so the memory is vague, but I seem to remember that this village was supposed to be the place where the famous Buddhist priest Nichiren II was born. On the day of his birth, 2 sea bream were said to have been washed up on the beach there, and the local fishermen have avoided catching bream ever since, so the sea there is thronged with them. We hired a boat and went out to sea. I was intent on the water, gazing entranced at the remarkable sight of all the purple-tinted sea bream milling below the surface. K, however, did not appear as interested. He seemed preoccupied with thoughts of Nichiren rather than fish. There was an impressive temple in the area called Tanji, or Birth Temple, no doubt referring to the saint's birth, and K suddenly announced that he was going to go to this temple and talk to its head priest. We were, I may say, very oddly dressed. K's appearance was particularly strange, since his hat had blown into the sea, and he was instead wearing a peasant's sedge hat that he had bought along the way. Both of us wore filthy robes that reeked of sweat. I urged K to give up the idea of meeting the priest, but he stubbornly persisted, declaring that if I didn't like it, I could wait outside. Since there was no arguing with him, I reluctantly went along as far as the temple's entrance hall. I was privately convinced we would be turned away, but priests are surprisingly civil people, and we were immediately shown into a fine large room to meet him. I was far from sharing K's religious interests back then, so I didn't pay much attention to what they said to each other, but I gathered that K was asking a great deal about Nichiren. I do remember the dismissive look on his face when the priest remarked that Nichiren was renowned for his excellent cursive writing style. K's own writing was far from good. He was after more profound information. I don't know that the priest was able to satisfy him, but once we left the temple grounds, K began to talk fervently to me about Nichiren. I was hot and exhausted and in no mood to listen to all this, so my responses were minimal. After a while even this became too much of an effort, so I simply remained silent and let him talk. It must have been the following evening, when we had arrived at our night's lodging, eaten, and were on the point of turning in, that things suddenly grew difficult between us. K was unhappy with the fact that I had not really listened to what he'd said to me about Nichiren the previous day. Anyone without spiritual aspirations is a fool, he declared, and he attacked me for what he obviously saw as my frivolity. For my part, the question of Osen of course complicated my feelings, and I couldn't simply laugh off his contemptuous accusations. I set about defending myself. Chapter 85. In those days I was in the habit of using the adjective human. K maintained that this favorite expression of mine was actually a cover for all my personal weaknesses. Thinking back on it now, I can see his point. But I had originally begun to use the word out of resistance to K, in order to convince him of his lack of human feelings, so I was not in a position to consider the question objectively. I stuck to my guns and reiterated my argument. Kay then demanded to know just what it was in him that I believed lacked this quality. "You're perfectly human. Indeed, you're even too human," was my response. "It's just that when you talk, the things you say lack humanity. And the same goes for your behavior." Kay offered no refutation, except to say that if he appeared that way, it was because he had not yet attained a sufficient level of spiritual discipline. This did not so much take the wind out of my sails as arouse my pity. I immediately stopped arguing, and he too soon grew calmer. "If only I shared his knowledge of the lives of the ancients," he remarked mournfully, "I wouldn't be attacking him in this way." When Kay spoke of the ancients, of course, he was not referring to men of legendary daring and courage. His heroes were the fierce ascetics of old, those mortifiers of the flesh who lashed themselves for the sake of spiritual attainment. He was sorry, Kay declared, that I had no understanding of what anguish he suffered from his own shortcomings. With this, we both went to sleep. The following morning we returned to business as usual and set off again to plod on our sweaty way. But my mind kept going back over the previous night's events. I burned with regret. Why had I passed up the perfect opportunity to say at last what was on my mind? Rather than employ an abstraction such as human, I should have made a clean and direct confession to Kay. And truly it was my feelings for Osun that had prompted me to start using this word in the first place, so it would have been more to the point to reveal to Kay the facts that lay behind my argument rather than belabor him with its theoretical distillation. Our relationship was so firmly defined by lofty scholarly exchange, I must admit, that I lacked the courage to break through it. I could explain this failing as that of affectation, or as the result of vanity, although what I mean by these words is not quite their normal interpretation. I only hope you will understand what I am saying here. We arrived back in Tokyo burned black by the sun. By this time I was in yet another frame of mind. Concepts such as human and other futile abstractions had all but vanished from my head. Chapter 86. But there was more. Something had changed in Osun's attitude, I noticed. Both Okusun and Osun set about providing us with the female care and attention that we needed to regain normalcy after our journey, but it seemed to me that Osun was far more attentive to me than to Kay. If it had been blatant, it might have made me uncomfortable, even irritated. But I was delighted at how decorously she behaved. She devoted the greater part of her innate kindness to me in a way that only I would notice. Kay therefore remained oblivious and unconcerned. A gleeful song of victory sang in my heart. Summer ended at last, and mid-September arrived, the time when lectures would resume. Our schedules meant that once more we came and went from the house at different hours. 3 times a week I returned later than Kay, but I never detected any sign of Osun's presence in his room. Kay went back to turning as I entered and remarking, "Just back, are you?" And I answered with my usual mechanical and meaningless response. It would have been the middle of October. I had overslept and rushed off to classes without changing out of the Japanese clothing I wore around the house. Rather than waste time with laced shoes, I hastily slipped on a pair of straw sandals. Our schedules meant that I would get back home before Kay did. When I arrived, I flung open the latter's door, assuming he wouldn't be there, and caught the sound of his voice within. I also heard Osun's laughter. Not needing to spend time unlacing my shoes at the door as usual, I stepped straight out of my sandals and into the house and opened the sliding doors to our rooms. My eyes took in the sight of Kay, seated as usual at his desk. Osun, however, was no longer in the room. All I caught was a glimpse of her retreating form, obviously making a hasty exit. I asked Kay why he had returned early. He had stayed home that day because he felt unwell, he replied. No sooner was I back in my room and seated than Osun appeared with tea, and now at last she greeted me. I was not the sort of person who could ask with an easy laugh why she had run away just then. Instead, the matter nagged at my mind. She stood up and went off down the veranda, but she paused a moment before Kay's room and exchanged a few words with him. They seemed to be a continuation of their previous talk, but as I had not heard what had gone before, I could make no sense of them. Over time Osun grew increasingly nonchalant. Even when we were both at home, she would go to Kay's room via the veranda and call his name. Then she would go in and make herself at home. Sometimes, of course, she was bringing him mail or delivering his washing, the kind of interaction that could only be considered normal for those living under the same roof, but my fierce and single-minded desire to have her all to myself drove me to read more into it. At times I felt she was going out of her way to avoid my room and visit only his. So why, you may ask, did I not ask Kay to leave the house? But that would have defeated the very purpose for bringing him there in the first place. It was beyond me to do it. Chapter 87. It was a cold, rainy day in November. Sodden in my overcoat, I made my way as usual past the fierce Enma image that stands in Genkaku Temple 1 and up the hill to the house. Kay's room was deserted, but his charcoal brazier was newly lit. I hurriedly opened the doors through to my room, eager to warm my chilled hands at my own glowing charcoal. But my brazier held only the cold white ash of its earlier fire. Even the embers were dead. My mood quickly shifted to one of displeasure. Okusun had heard me arrive and came to greet me. Seeing me standing silent in the middle of the room, she sympathetically helped me out of my coat and into my casual household kimono. I complained of the cold, and she obligingly carried in K's brazier from next door. Was K home yet? I asked. He had returned and then gone out again, she told me. This puzzled me, as it was a day when his class schedule meant he came home later than I. He probably had some business to attend to, Okusan said. I sat for a while reading. The house was still and hushed, there was no sound of any voice, and after a while the early winter chill, combined with the desolate silence, began to penetrate me. Seized by a sudden urge to be among a bustling throng of people, I put my book down and rose to my feet. The rain seemed to have lifted at last, but the sky still hung heavily chill and leaden, so to be on the safe side, as I went out I slung an oilpaper umbrella over my shoulder. I set off east down the hill, following the earthen wall that ran along the rear of the arsenal. In those days the roads were not yet improved, and the slope was a lot steeper than it is today. The street was narrower and not straight as now. As you descended into the valley, high buildings blocked the sun, and because drainage was poor, it was damp and muddy underfoot. The worst section was between the narrow stone bridge and the street of Yanagi-ch. Even in high rain clogs or rubber boots, you had to tread carefully to avoid the mud. Everyone was forced to pick their way gingerly along the long thin rut that had formed in the middle of the road. It was a mere foot or two wide, so it was a bit like walking along a kimono sash that had been casually unrolled down the center of the road. People made their way cautiously, in single file. I was negotiating this narrow strip when I ran abruptly into K, concentrating on where I was putting my feet. I was unaware of him until we were face to face. Only when I raised my eyes on impulse to see what was suddenly blocking my way did I discover him there. Where had he been? I asked. He had just stepped out for a bit, he said. His reply was typically brief and unresponsive. We maneuvered past each other on the narrow strip of navigable road, and as we did, I saw that a young woman was behind him. Short-sighted as I was, I had not seen her until now, but once Kay had passed me, my eyes fell on her face, and I was astonished to discover that it was Osun. She greeted me, her cheeks slightly flushed. In those days, fashionable girls wore their hair swept straight back from the forehead and coiled on top of the head. For a long moment I stared blankly at this twist of hair. Then I became conscious of the fact that one of us would have to make way for the other. Resolutely, I stepped aside, putting one foot into the mud and so leaving a space for her to pass me with relative ease. When I arrived at Yanagi-ch, I could not think where to go. All possibilities now felt equally bleak. For a while I tramped despairingly along through the sludge, oblivious to the splashes, then went home again. Chapter 88. I asked Kay if he and Osun had left the house together. No, he replied. They had come across each other in Masago-ch, he explained, so they came home together. I could not really question him further, but over dinner I felt an urge to ask Osun the same question. Her response was to laugh in that way I so disliked, then to challenge me to guess where she'd been. In those days I had a quick temper, and I felt a sudden surge of anger at being treated so flippantly. Okusan was the only person at the table to notice, however. Kay remained oblivious. I was uncertain whether Osun was being intentionally teasing or only innocently playful. As young women went, she was very astute, but I had to admit that certain aspects of her were typical of the things about other girls that annoyed me. It was since K's arrival in the house that I had begun to notice these irritating traits. I was unsure whether to put this down to my own jealousy of Kay or to her artfulness in relation to me. I am not inclined even now to dismiss my jealousy. As I have said many times, I was well aware that jealousy was at work below my love for Osun. The smallest trifle, something that would be quite insignificant to anyone else, could set it off. To digress for a moment, it seems to me that this kind of jealousy is perhaps a necessary part of love. Since my marriage, I have been aware that my jealous impulses have slowly faded. At the same time, I no longer feel that early fierce passion of love. Hesitant as my heart had been, I now knew I had to gather my courage and fling it down before her. By her I mean Okusan, not Osun. My plan was to set marriage discussions in motion by coming straight out and asking for Osun's hand. Yet though my decision was made, I still held back from day to day. I know this makes me seem terribly irresolute, I don't mind that it does. But my inability to act did not stem from lack of willpower. Before Kay had appeared on the scene, any move I felt the urge to make was blocked by my abhorrence of falling into a trap as I had done once before. After Kay's arrival, my suspicion that she might be more attracted to him held me back. If she did indeed favor him, I had decided, then there was no value in declaring my own love. It was not so much that the thought of the shame was painful to me, it was rather that, no matter how I loved her, I hated the thought of marrying a woman who secretly longed for another. Many men are perfectly happy to marry the girl they love whether she returns the feelings or not, but in those days I considered such men to be more worldly and cynical than we were, or else more obtuse to the workings of love. I was much too ardent to have any truck with the notion that once you marry you somehow simply settle down. In a word, I had a romantic faith in the nobility of love, while simultaneously practicing a devious form of it. Naturally, during all our long time together there had been occasions when I could have confessed myself directly to Osun and asked for her hand, but I had purposely chosen not to. I was very conscious of the fact that Japanese convention forbade such things, but it was not really this alone that restrained me. I assumed that in such a situation Japanese, and particularly Japanese girls, lacked the courage to be frank and honest, so I could not hope for a candid response from her. Chapter 90. Kei persisted with his questions about Okusun and Osun. Eventually he began to ask the kind of personal question that I had no way of answering. I was not so much annoyed as astonished. There was a glaring contrast between his indifference whenever I had brought up the subject of these two on previous occasions, and his very different attitude now. Finally I asked why he was suddenly so obsessed with the subject today. He instantly fell silent, but his closed mouth twitched tremulously. He never spoke much, and when he did, he had the habit of first working his mouth around. The weight of his utterances was no doubt evidenced in the way the lips resisted his will and opened only reluctantly. The voice that finally broke through was twice as strong as that of an average man. Seeing his mouth working now, I knew that something was coming, but I had no clue what was in store. You can imagine my amazement when Kei launched into a ponderous confession of his agonized love for Osun. I froze, as if his words were a magic wand that turned me instantly to stone. My mouth failed to so much as twitch in an effort to respond. My whole being was reduced to a single concentrated point of terror, of pain. I stiffened instantaneously from head to foot, like stone or steel. So rigid was I that I almost lost the power of breath. Luckily, however, this state quickly passed. A moment later I had returned to human feelings. And now a bitter regret swept over me. He had beaten me to it. I had no idea what my next move should be, however. I was too distressed, I suppose, to think coherently. I simply remained frozen, uncomfortably aware of the nasty sweat that was soaking the armpits of my shirt. Kei, meanwhile, was continuing the faltering confession of his love, pausing from time to grope for words. I was in agony. My distress must have been written on my face as blatantly as some advertising poster, I thought. Even Kei must surely notice it. But it seemed in fact that his attention was too deeply focused on himself to register my expression. His confession never varied in tone. There was a heavy dullness to it, it seemed to me, and a kind of unyielding inertia. While part of me listened to this faltering declaration, my heart was seething with the question, what shall I do? Oh, what shall I do? So that I scarcely comprehended the details of what Kei was saying. The overall tone of his words, however, struck me to the core. So my pain was now mixed with a kind of terror, the beginnings of a horrified recognition that he was stronger than I. When Kei finished, I could say nothing. I was not struck dumb by any internal debate about whether it would be wiser to make the same confession to him or to keep my secret to myself. It was simply that I could not speak. Nor did I wish to. At lunch Kei and I faced each other across the table. Served by the maid, we ate what seemed to me an unusually tasteless meal. We spoke barely a word during the meal. We had no idea when Okusun and Osun would return. Chapter 91. We returned to our separate rooms and did not see each other again. Kei was as silent as he'd been that morning. I too sat quietly, deep in thought. It seemed clear to me that I should reveal my heart to Kei, but I also felt that my chance had already passed. My silence had been a terrible mistake, it seemed to me now. I should have cut across his words with a counteroffensive. At the very least, I would have been wiser to follow his confession by frankly telling him my own feelings. At this stage, no matter how I looked at it, with Kei's confession over and done with, it would be awkward to come back to the subject and express my own feelings. I could see no way to bring it up naturally. I felt dizzy with remorse. If only he would open the sliding doors that separated us and charge into the room again, I thought. Earlier, he had caught me off guard, quite unprepared to cope with him. My underlying impulse now was to somehow regain the advantage I had lost that morning. From time to time I raised my eyes expectantly to the sliding doors. But the doors stayed closed. And beyond them Kei remained quiet. After a while this hush started to unnerve me. What would he be thinking in there? No sooner had the question entered my head than it began to obsess me. It was perfectly normal for us to maintain separate silences on either side of the doors, and usually the quieter Kei was, the more likely I was to forget he was there. In my present state, however, I was clearly a bit mad. Yet despite my urgent need to confront him, I could not take the offensive and open the doors myself. Having missed my chance to speak, I now could only wait for his next move. At length I could stay still no more. The longer I forced myself to remain motionless, the more urgently I longed to leap up and burst into Kei's room. There was nothing for it but to get up and go out onto the veranda. From there I moved on into the sitting room, where I absently poured myself a cup of hot water from the kettle and drank it. Then I went out to the entrance hall, and from there, having carefully avoided Kei's room, I found myself out in the road. Needless to say, I had no destination in mind. I simply needed to keep moving. I wandered aimlessly through streets that were bright with New Year decorations. Walk as I might, Kay continued to fill my mind. In fact, I was not even attempting to rid myself of such thoughts by walking. As I prowled the streets, my mind was intent on chewing over and digesting the image of him that hung before me. Above all, he puzzled me. Why should he have unburdened himself to me out of the blue like that? Why had his passion reached such a pitch that he felt he must confess it to me? And where had his normal self disappeared to? I could find no answers. I knew how strong he was, and how intensely earnest. I was convinced that there was a lot more I needed to know before I could decide on my own attitude. On the other hand, the thought of having anything more to do with him was strangely repugnant. As I strode about the town in a daze, Kay's face, as he sat quietly in his room, was constantly before my eyes, while a voice seemed to be telling me that no matter how I walked, he would remain impervious to me. In short, I had begun to feel an almost magical power in him. Perhaps, I even found myself thinking, he had cast an evil spell that would last the rest of my life. When at length I came home, exhausted, there was still no sound of life from Kay's room. Chapter 93. Kay's evasive response was unmistakably echoed in his attitude the next day and the day after. He showed not the least inclination to broach the subject at issue between us. Granted, he had no opportunity to do so. We could not take our time and discuss things calmly unless both Okusun and Osun had left the house for the day. I knew this perfectly well. Yet it still riled me. I had prepared myself in wait for Kay to make the next move, but now I changed my mind and decided that I would be the one to speak first if a chance presented itself. I was also silently watchful of Okusun and Osun. However, I detected nothing in either of them that was in the least different from usual. If their behavior had not visibly changed since Kay's confession, I felt, then he'd clearly confessed himself to me alone. He had yet to broach it with either Osun or her guardian. This thought brought me some small comfort. In that case, I decided, it was better to lie in wait for a moment when I could naturally bring up the subject rather than make it obvious that I was purposely creating one. I would lay the topic aside for the moment and let things be. Put this way, the decision sounds terribly simple. But the process I went through to reach it involved surges of thought and emotion, high and low, that swept through my heart like tides. I observed Kay's stolid immobility, and imputed various meanings to it. I kept a close watch on all that Okusun and Osun did and spoke, and questioned whether what I saw truly reflected what was in their hearts. Could that delicate and complex instrument that lies in the human breast ever really produce a reading that was absolutely clear and truthful, like a clock's hands pointing to numbers on its dial? I wondered. In other words, only after a convoluted process of interpreting everything now one way and now another did I finally settle on my decision, although strictly speaking the word settle is singularly inappropriate for my state of mind at the time. Lectures began again. On days when our schedule coincided, we set off together, and if it was convenient for us both, we came home together. To an outsider, we would have appeared just as friendly as before. Yet each of us within his heart was most certainly thinking his separate thoughts. One day as we were walking along together, I chose my moment and suddenly took the offensive. I began by asking whether he had made his recent confession only to me or whether he had spoken. Chapter 94. One day I paid a rare visit to the university library. My supervisor had instructed me to check on something related to my field of study for the following week. Settling myself at a corner of one of the large desks, where the sunlight from the nearby window fell across me, I flipped through recently arrived foreign journals. I could not find what I wanted, however, so I had to keep going back to the shelves. Finally I came across the article I was after and set about avidly reading. At this point someone on the other side of the desk softly called my name. Raising my eyes, I discovered Kay standing there. He leaned forward over the desk toward me, his face close to mine. It is library etiquette not to disturb nearby readers, so Kay's action was perfectly reasonable, but on this occasion it strangely unnerved me. Are you studying? He asked in a low voice. I have to look something up, I replied. His face still hovered close to mine. In the same low voice he asked if I would come out for a walk. Yes, I replied, if he would wait just a little. I'll wait, he said, and sank down on the chair directly in front of me. This had the effect of distracting me so much that I found it impossible to concentrate anymore. The conviction seized me that he had something up his sleeve and had come to discuss things with me. I was driven to lay down my journal and rise. Finished? Kay serenely inquired, seeing me begin to get to my feet. It's not important, I answered. I returned the journal, and we left the library together. We had no particular destination in mind, so we walked through Tatsukasi-H to Ikinahata and on into Ueno Park. There Kay suddenly broached the subject that lay between us. All things considered, it seemed obvious that he had invited me out for a walk for this purpose. But he still showed no evidence of moving toward a plan of action. What do you think? He asked. What he wanted to know was how I saw him, knowing the depths of love to which he had succumbed. He was, in other words, seeking a critical evaluation of his present state. I could tell from this how unlike his usual self he was. Let me remind you that he had none of that weakness of character that makes most people concerned with what others are thinking. He had the kind of daring and courage that would simply press ahead once he decided something. I had all too vivid memories of this characteristic from the time of his family troubles, so the difference in his present behavior was quite clear to me. Why was my opinion so important now? I asked him. The fact was, he was ashamed of his weakness, he replied in an unusually dejected voice. He was at a loss, no longer had a clear sense of things, so all he could do was seek a fair assessment from me. I cut in with a question, what did he mean by at a loss? He didn't know whether to proceed or retreat, he explained. I pressed in another step, and asked whether he thought himself capable of retreat, if that was what he decided. Words now failed him. Its agony was all he managed. And indeed he looked racked. If the person at issue had not been Osen, I could have poured such a balm of soothing reassurances upon those poor tortured features. I flatter myself that I was born with a compassionate sympathy for others. Just then, however, I was a different person. Chapter 95. I watched K's every move, vigilant as a man pitting himself against someone trained in a different school of combat. My eyes, my heart, my body, every atom of my being, was focused on him with unwavering intent. In his innocence, K was completely unwary. He was not so much poorly defended as utterly vulnerable. It was as if I could lift from his very hands the map of a fortress that was in his charge and take all the time I wanted to examine it as he watched. Now I understood that he had lost his way in a labyrinth between his ideals and reality. I felt with conviction that I could knock him down with a single blow. My eyes fixed on this purpose, I stepped straight into the breach. I grew instantly solemn. It was part of my strategy, but in fact I was tense enough for it to feel perfectly natural, so I was in no position to notice that I was behaving shamefully, even comically. I began by tossing back at him the statement anyone without spiritual aspirations is a fool. The words he had used against me on our journey around BSH, I threw them at him in precisely the tone he had used to me then. I didn't do it vindictively, however. I confess that I had a crueler aim than mere revenge. I wanted with these words to block K's way to love. K had been born into the Pure Land sect, which encourages its priests to marry, but once he reached his teenage years, he developed beliefs that were somewhat different. I am poorly qualified to speak on this, I know, as I lack much understanding of sectarian differences, but I was certainly aware of how he felt about relations between the sexes. K had always loved the expression spiritual austerity, which I understood to contain the idea of control over the passions. Later I had discovered that those words held a still more rigorous meaning for him. His prime article of faith was the necessity to sacrifice everything in pursuit of the true way. Following the path was not only a question of self-denial and abstinence, even selfless love, beyond the realms of desire, was conceived as a stumbling block. I had often heard him declaim about this in the days when he was self-supporting. I was already in love with Osen back then, so naturally I threw myself into defending the realms of desire. He had looked at me pityingly, with much more contempt than sympathy in his eyes. Now, with all that lay between us, the words I had just thrown back at K would certainly have struck home painfully. But as I have said, I was not using them to strike at the philosophy he had so rigorously cultivated. I wanted instead for him to stay true to his old convictions. Whether he attained his spiritual aspirations was beside the point, he could reach enlightenment itself, for all I cared. My single fear was that he would change the direction he had chosen for his life and thereby come into conflict with my own interests. In other words, blatant self-interest lay behind my words. Anyone without spiritual aspirations is a fool, I repeated, watching to see what effect these words would have on K. A fool, K responded at length. I'm a fool. He came to an instantaneous halt and stood rooted to the spot, staring at the ground. This startled me. He seemed to me like a cornered thief who will suddenly turn threatening. Then I realized that he presented no danger. All the power had left his voice. I longed to read his eyes, but they remained averted. Then, slowly, he set off walking once more. Chapter 96. I walked along beside him, ready, or perhaps better to say lying in wait, for what he would say next. I felt quite prepared to spring an underhanded attack on him if need be. But I also had the conscience that education had instilled in me. If someone had appeared at my side and whispered coward, I would surely have come to myself with a start. And if that man had been K, I would have blushed before him. But K was far too honest to reproach me, far too pure-hearted, too good. In the blind urgency of the moment, however, I failed to honor this in him. Instead I struck home. I used his own virtue to defeat him. After a while K spoke my name and turned to look at me. This time it was I who stopped in my tracks. K halted too. At last I was able to look him directly in the eye. His superior height forced me to look up at him, but I did so with the heart of a wolf crouching before an innocent lamb. Let's not talk about it anymore, he said. There was a strange grief both in his voice and in the expression in his eyes. I could say nothing in reply. Please stop, he said again, pleading now. My answer was cruel. I leaped like a wolf upon the lamb's throat. I wasn't the one who brought it up, you know. You began it. If you want to stop, that's fine by me. But there's no point in just shutting up. You have to resolve to put a stop to it in your heart as well. What about all those fine principles of yours? Where's your moral fiber? At these words, his tall frame seemed to shrink and dwindle before my eyes. He was, as I have said, incredibly obstinate and headstrong, yet he was also far too honest to be able to shrug it off if his own inconsistency was forcefully brought home to him. Seeing him cowed, I at last breathed a sigh of relief. Then he said suddenly, "Resolve?" Before I could respond, he went on, "Resolve, well, I'm not without resolve." He spoke as if to himself, or as if in a trance. Our conversation came to a halt, and we turned toward home. It was a fairly warm and windless day, but nevertheless it was winter, and the leafless park felt desolate. I turned once to look back at the russet shapes of the frost-burned cedars, their tips neatly aligned against the gloomy sky, and felt the cold sink its teeth into my back. We hurried on in the dusk over Hong Hill and dipped into the valley below Koishikawa. Only now did I at last feel the beginnings of a glow of warmth inside my overcoat. We barely spoke on our way home, though our haste might explain this silence. When we were back and seated at the dinner table, Okusan asked why we had been late. I replied that Kei had invited me out, and we had gone to Ueno. "On such a cold day?" said Okusan in surprise. Osun wondered what had taken us there. "Nothing," I replied simply, "we had just gone for a walk." Always taciturn, Kei now spoke even less than usual. He failed to make the slightest response to Okusan's cajolings and Osun's smiles. He gulped down his food, and retired to his room while I was still at the table. Chapter 98. I was well aware that Kei usually acted decisively, but I could also see perfectly well why he was being so astonishingly irresolute now. I proudly believed, in other words, that my knowledge of the norm gave me a clear grasp of the present exception. But as I slowly digested this word resolve, my confident pride teetered and finally began to crumble. Perhaps he was not behaving so out of character after all. Perhaps, in fact, he held carefully tucked away within his breast the means by which to solve at a stroke all his doubts, anguish, and torment. When I considered the word resolve in this fresh light, a shock ran through me. I would probably have been wiser to turn this astonishment to good account and coolly reconsider just what this resolve might constitute. Sadly, however, I was blinded by my own single-minded preoccupation. The only interpretation I could imagine was that he was resolved to act in relation to Osun. I leaped to the conclusion that his decisiveness would be exercised in the pursuit of love. A voice whispered in my ear that it was time for me too to be decisive, and I unhesitatingly complied. I gathered my courage for a final resolve. I must act before Kei did, and without his knowledge, I decided. Silently I awaited my chance. 2 or 3 days passed, however, and no opportunity presented itself. I was waiting for a time when Kei was out and Osun had also left the house, when I could approach Okusan in private. But day after day either he or she was always there to stymie my plan. The longed-for moment never arrived. I seethed with impatience. A week later I could finally wait no longer, and I faked illness to attain my end. I lay in bed until around 10, grunting a vague response when Okusan, Osun, and Kei himself told me it was time to get up. When Kei and Osun had both left and a hush had fallen on the house, I finally left my bed. "What's the matter?" Okusan asked when she saw me appear. She urged me to go back to bed and said she would bring me something to eat. But I was in no mood to sleep further, being in fact perfectly well. I washed my face and ate in the sitting room as usual, while Okusan served me from the other side of the brazier. As I sat there, bowl in hand, eating what could be either breakfast or lunch, I was agonizing over how to broach the subject of Osun, so no doubt I looked every bit the part of a suffering invalid. I finished the meal and lit a cigarette. Okusan could not leave until I rose, so she sat on beside the brazier. The maid was called in to remove the dishes, while Okusan kept me company, busying herself with topping up the kettle or wiping the rim of the brazier as she sat there. "Is there something you ought to be doing?" I asked. "No," she said, then inquired why I wanted to know. "Actually," I replied, "I have something I'd like to discuss." "What is it?" she said casually, her eyes on my face. She was treating the moment lightly, apparently unreceptive to my mood, and I faltered over how to proceed. After beating about the bush for a while, I finally asked whether Kei had recently said anything to her. "What about?" she asked, startled. Then, before I could answer, she said, "Did he say something to you?" Chapter 99. No, I replied, having no intention of telling Okusan what Kei had confessed to me. But the lie immediately made me unhappy. I awkwardly backed away from it by saying that Kei hadn't asked me to say anything on his behalf that I could recall, and my present business had nothing to do with him. "I see," she said, and waited for more. There was nothing for it but to broach the subject at last. "Okusan," I said abruptly, "I wish to marry Osun." She took this more calmly than I had anticipated, although she stared at me in silence, apparently at a loss how to respond. But I had gone too far now to let her gaze disconcert me. Please, Okusun. Please let me marry her, I said. Let me make her my wife. Okusun's mature years lent her far greater calm than I could muster. That's all very well, she replied, but isn't this rather hasty? It's now I want to marry her, I said, which made her laugh. Have you thought this through properly? She went on. I earnestly assured her that although the request was sudden, the impulse behind it was anything but. A few more questions followed, which I have forgotten. Okusun had quite a masculine clarity and directness that made her far easier to talk to than the usual woman in this kind of situation. Very good, she finally said. You may have her. Or rather, she corrected herself, since I'm not in a position to speak so patronizingly, let me say, please take her for your wife. As you know, the poor girl has no father to give her away. And so the question was settled, straightforwardly and without fuss. It would have taken no more than 15 minutes from beginning to end. Okusun demanded no conditions. It would not be necessary to consult the relatives, she maintained. All she had to do was inform them of the decision. She even stated that there was no need to consult the wishes of Osun herself. Here I balked, educated man though I was apparently the more conventional in such matters. As for the relatives, I said, I would leave that up to her, but surely the right thing to do next was to gain the girl's consent. Please don't worry, Okusun replied. I wouldn't make her marry anyone she didn't want to. Once back in my room, I felt somewhat unnerved at how remarkably smoothly the discussion had gone. I even found myself almost doubting that it could all really be as safely settled as it seemed. At the same time, however, my whole being was swept with a sense of renewal at the thought that the future was now decided. Around noon I went into the living room and asked Okusun when she planned to tell Osun the news of our conversation. Since she had already agreed, she said, it didn't matter when she told her daughter. I turned to go back to my room with the uncomfortable feeling that she was playing the male far better than I was in all this, but Okusun held me back. If I wished, she said, she would tell her daughter right away, as soon as she came back from her lessons that day. That would be best, I agreed, and returned to my room. But the idea of sitting mutely at my desk listening as the two of them murmured together in the distance made me jittery. At length I put on my hat and went out. And now once again, on the road below the house, I crossed paths with Osun coming up. Quite innocent of all that had happened, she looked surprised to see me. You're back, are you? I said politely, raising my hat. Are you better now? She asked in a rather puzzled tone. Yes, much better, thanks, I replied, and stepped briskly around the corner towards Sweet Bridge. Chapter 102. I realized that 2 days or more had passed since Okusun had told Kei about our engagement. Nothing in Kei's manner toward me had hinted that he knew anything, so I had remained unaware of it. I was now filled with respect for his composure, even though it was no doubt only superficial. By any standard, he was by far the better man. Though I've won through cunning, the real victory is his was the thought that spun in my head. How he must despise me, I said to myself, and I blushed with shame. Yet it mortified me to imagine going to Kei after all this and submitting to the inevitable humiliation. Floundering in indecision, I finally put off the question of what to do until the next day. This was Saturday evening. That night, however, Kei killed himself. I still shudder at the memory of finding him there. I usually slept with my head facing east, but for some reason, fate, perhaps, that evening I had laid out my bedding to face the opposite direction. I was awakened in the night by a chill draft blowing in on my face. Opening my eyes, I saw that the sliding doors between our 2 rooms, which were normally closed, stood slightly ajar, just as they had when he appeared there some nights earlier. This time, however, Kei's dark figure was not standing in the doorway. As if with a sudden presentiment, I cocked myself on one elbow and peered tensely into his room. The lamp had burned low. The bedding was laid out, but the edge of the quilt was thrown back. And there was Kei, slumped forward with his back to me. I called out to him. There was no response. Is something wrong? I called again, but his body remained motionless. I leaped up and went to the doorway. Standing there, I surveyed his room by the lamp's faint light. My first feeling was almost the same as the initial shock his sudden confession of love had given me. I took in the room with a single sweeping glance, and then my gaze froze, my eyeballs stared in their sockets as if made of glass. I stood rooted to the spot. When this first gale of shock had blown through me, my next thought was, oh God, it's all over. The knowledge that this was irredeemable shot its black blaze through my future and for an instant lit with terrifying clarity all the life that lay before me. Then I began to tremble. But even in this extremity I could not forget about myself. My eyes fell on a letter lying on the desk. It was addressed to me, as I had guessed. Frantically, I tore open the seal. But I was not prepared for what I read there. I had assumed that this letter would say things deeply painful for me to read, and I was terrified at how Okusun and Osun would despise me if they saw it. A quick glance instantly relieved me, however. Saved. I thought. In fact, of course, it was only my reputation that was saved, but how others saw me was a matter of immense importance just then. The letter was simple and contained nothing specific. He was committing suicide, he wrote, because he was weak and infirm of purpose, and because the future held nothing for him. With a few brief words he thanked me for all I had done for him. As a final request, he asked me to see to his affairs after his death. He also asked me to apologize to Okusun for the trouble he was causing her and to inform his family. The letter was a series of simple statements of essential matters. The only thing missing was any mention of Osun. I read it to the end and understood that Kay had deliberately avoided mentioning her. But it was the letter's final words that pierced my heart most keenly. With the last of the brush sink, he had added that he should have died sooner and did not know why he had lived so long. I folded the letter with trembling hands and slid it back into its envelope. I replaced it carefully on the desk so that it would be clearly visible to the others. Then I turned and at last I saw the blood that had spurted over the sliding doors. Chapter 103. Impulsively I lifted Kay's head a little, cradling it in both hands. I wanted to take in for a moment the sight of his dead face. But when I peered up at the face that hung there, I instantly released him. It was not simply horror at the sight. His head felt appallingly heavy. I stared down for a while at the cold ears I had touched, and at the closely cropped head of thick hair, so normal and familiar. I had not the least urge to cry. My only feeling was fear. This was not simply a commonplace fright stimulated by the scene before my eyes. What I felt was a deep terror of my fate, a fate that spoke to me from the abrupt chill of my friend's body. I returned to my room in a stupor and began to pace. Pointless though it is, my brain instructed me, for now you must just keep moving. I had to do something, I thought, and simultaneously I was thinking, there's nothing I can do. I could only turn and turn in the room, like a caged bear. A few times I had the impulse to go in and wake Okusun. But this was quickly checked by the thought that it would be wrong to show a woman such a horrifying sight. I was paralyzed by a fierce resolve that I must not shock either her or, above all, her daughter. And so I would return to my pacing and circling. At some point I lit my lamp, and from time to time I glanced at the clock. Nothing was more tediously slow than that clock. I had no idea exactly when I had woken, but it was definitely sometime close to daybreak. As I turned and turned in the room, waiting desperately for dawn to come, I was tortured by the sensation that this black night might never end. We were in the habit of rising before 7, since many of our lectures began at 8. This meant that the maid got up around 6. It was not yet 6 when I went to wake her that day. My footsteps woke Okusun, who pointed out to me that it was Sunday. If you're awake, I said to Okusun, perhaps you could come to my room a moment. She followed me, a kimono coat draped over her nightdress. I quickly closed the far doors to K's room. Then I said in a low voice, something dreadful has happened. What is it? She asked. Don't be shocked, I said, indicating the next door room with my chin. She turned pale. Kay has committed suicide. Okusun stood as though paralyzed, staring mutely at me. I suddenly found myself sinking to my knees before her, head lowered in contrition. I'm so sorry. It's all my fault, I said. Now this unforgivable thing has happened to you and Osun. I had had no thought of saying any such thing before I faced her. Only when I saw her expression did the words spring to my lips, unbidden. Consider it an apology directed to the two ladies, but it was really meant for Kay, whom it could no longer reach. Those impulsive words of remorse were spoken beyond my will, directly from my natural being. Fortunately for me, Okusun did not read my words so deeply. Though ashen, she said comfortingly, what could you possibly have done about something so unforeseen? But her face was carved deep with shock and dread, the muscles rigid. Chapter 105. On the way back from K's funeral, one of his friends asked me why I thought he had killed himself. This question had been dogging me ever since his suicide. Okusun, Osun, K's father and brother, acquaintances whom I had informed, even unknown newspaper reporters, all had asked me the same thing. Every time someone asked, my conscience smarted painfully, and I heard behind the words a voice say, quick, confess that it was you who killed him. My answer to everyone was the same. I simply repeated the words of his final letter to me and made no further statement. The fellow who had asked me on our way back from the funeral, and received the same answer, now took from his pocket a newspaper cutting and handed it to me. I read the piece he indicated as we walked on. It said that Kay had killed himself from despair at being disinherited. I folded the page and returned it to him without comment. He told me that another paper had reported that Kay had gone mad and killed himself. I had been too preoccupied to look at newspapers and so was quite ignorant of all this, although I had all along been concerned about what they might write. Above all, I feared that something unpleasant or disturbing for Okusun and Osun might appear there. It particularly tortured me to think that Osun might be so much as mentioned in passing. I asked this friend if anything else had been written in the papers. These two references were all he had seen, he told me. Soon after this I moved into the house where I still live. Both Okusun and Osun disliked the thought of staying in their old house, while every evening I found myself reliving the memory of that night. After some discussion, therefore, we decided to find somewhere else. After 2 months I graduated from the university. 6 months later Osun and I finally married. On the face of things I could congratulate myself on all having gone according to plan. Both Okusun and Osun seemed wonderfully happy, and so indeed was I. But a black shadow hovered behind my happiness. This very happiness, it seemed to me, could well be a fuse that drew the flame of my life toward a bitter fate. Once married, Osun, but I should now begin to call her my wife for some reason suggested that we visit K's grave together. This jolted me. Why had she suddenly come up with such an idea? I inquired. She replied that it would surely please K if we visited him together. I stared hard at her guileless face, until she asked why I was looking at her like that. I agreed to her request, and together we went to Jigaya. I poured water over K's fresh grave and washed it. My wife placed incense and flowers before it. We both bowed our heads and placed our hands together in prayer. No doubt she wished to receive K's blessing from beyond the grave by conveying to him the news of our marriage. As for me, the words I was to blame were going around and around in my head. My wife stroked K's headstone and declared it a fine one. It was not particularly impressive, but she probably felt the need to praise it because I had personally gone to the stonemason and chosen it. Privately, I balanced in my mind the images of this new grave, my new wife, and K's new white bones lying buried at my feet, and a sense of the cold mockery of fate crept over me. I vowed then that I would never come here with her again. Chapter 107. No longer able to forget myself in a living tomb of books, I tried instead to drown my soul in drink. I cannot say I like alcohol, but I am someone who can drink if I choose to, and I set about obliterating my heart by drinking all I could. This was a puerile way out, of course, and it very quickly led to an even greater despair with the world. In the midst of a drunken stupor, I would come to my senses and realize what an idiot I was to try to fool myself like this. Then my vision and understanding grew clear, and I sat shivering and sober. There were desolate times when even the poor disguise of drunkenness failed to work, no matter how I drank. And each time I sought pleasure in drink, I emerged more depressed than ever. My darling wife and her mother were unavoidably witness to all this and naturally did their best to make sense of it as they could. I gathered that my wife's mother sometimes said some rather unpleasant things about me to her, although she never passed them on to me. My wife could not resist being critical herself, however. She never spoke strongly, of course, and I very rarely became provoked to the point where I lost my temper. She would simply ask me from time to tell her honestly if there was something about her that bothered me. Stop drinking, she would say, you'll ruin yourself. Sometimes she wept and declared, you've become a changed person. But worst of all was when she added, you wouldn't have changed like this if Kay was still alive. I agreed that that might well be true, but I was filled with sorrow at the gulf that lay between our separate understandings of this remark. And yet I still felt no urge to explain everything to her. Sometimes I apologized to her, the morning after I had come home late and drunk. She would laugh, or else fall silent, and occasionally she wept. Whatever her reaction, I hated myself. In apologizing to her, I was actually apologizing to myself. Finally I gave up drinking, less because of my wife's admonishments than because of self-disgust. I gave up drink, but I remained disinclined to do anything else. I resorted to books again, to pass the time. But my reading was aimless, I simply read each book and tossed it aside. Whenever my wife asked what the point of my study was, I responded with a bitter smile. In my heart, though, I was saddened that the person I loved and trusted most in the world could not understand me. But it's within your power to help her understand, I thought, and yet you're too cowardly to do so, and I grew still sadder. Desolation filled me. There were many times when I felt I lived utterly alone, remote and cut off from the world around me. All this time the cause of K's death continued to obsess me. At the time it happened, the single thought of love had engrossed me, and no doubt this preoccupation influenced my simplistic understanding of the event. I had immediately concluded that K killed himself because of a broken heart. But once I could look back on it in a calmer frame of mind, it struck me that his motive was surely not so simple and straightforward. Had it resulted from a fatal collision between reality and ideals? Perhaps, but this was still not quite it. Eventually, I began to wonder whether it was not the same unbearable loneliness that I now felt that had brought K to his decision. I shuddered. Like a chill wind, the presentiment that I might be treading the same path as K had walked began from time to send shivers through me. Chapter 108. Time passed, and my wife's mother became ill. The doctor who examined her told us it was incurable. I nursed her devotedly, both for her own sake and for the sake of the wife I loved. In larger terms, however, I did so also for the sake of humanity itself. I had long felt an urgent need to act in some way, but I remained at an impasse, sitting idle as the years passed. Isolated as I was from the human world, I felt for the first time that I was doing something of real worth. I was sustained by what I can only describe as a sense of atonement for past sin. In due course my wife's mother died, leaving my wife and me alone together. I was all she had left in life to trust and depend on, she said to me. At these words, tears filled my eyes to think that she had to trust someone who had forfeited all trust in himself. Poor thing, I thought, and I even said as much to her. Why? She asked, uncomprehending. But I could not explain. She cried then. You're always so cynical and watchful of me, she said bitterly. That's why you say such things. After her mother's death, I did my best to be kind and gentle to her, and not simply because I loved her. No, behind my solicitous attention lay something larger, something that transcended the individual. My heart was stirring, just as it had when I nursed her mother. This change seemed to make her happy. Yet behind her happiness I sensed a vague uneasiness that sprang from puzzlement. Even if she had understood, however, she would hardly have felt reassured. It seems to me that women are more inclined than men to respond to the sort of kindness that focuses exclusively on themselves, even if it is morally questionable from a stricter perspective, and that they are less able to fully appreciate the kind of love that derives from the larger claims of humanity. Once she wondered aloud to me whether a man's heart and a woman's could ever really become one. I replied evasively that they probably can when you are young. She seemed then to be gazing back at her own past, and at length she gave a tiny sigh. From around this time, a horrible darkness would occasionally grip me. At first the force that would suddenly overwhelm me seemed external, but as time went by, my heart began to stir of its own accord in response to this fearful shadow. In the end I came to feel that it was no external thing but something secretly nurtured all along deep within my own breast. Whenever the sensation came upon me, I questioned my own sanity. But I had no inclination to consult a doctor, or anybody else for that matter. What this feeling produced was, quite simply, a keen awareness of the nature of human sin. That is what sent me back each month to K.S. grave. It is also what lay behind the nursing of my dying mother-in-law, and what bade me treat my wife so tenderly. There were even times when I longed for some stranger to come along and flog me as I deserved. At some stage this feeling transformed into a conviction that it should be I who hurt myself. And then the thought struck me that I should not just hurt myself but kill myself. At all events, I resolved that I must live my life as if I were already dead. How many years has it been since I made that decision? My wife and I have lived in peace together all that time. We have in no way been unhappy, quite the opposite. But this one thing in me, this thing that for me is so vital, has always been for my wife a place of incomprehensible darkness. The thought fills me with pity for her. Chapter 110. I had almost forgotten the expression to die with your Lord. It's not a phrase that is used in normal life these days. It must have lain there deep in my memory all these years, decaying slowly. Reminded of it by my wife's jest, I replied that if I were to die a loyal follower's death, the Lord I was following to the grave would be the spirit of the Meiji era itself. I was joking too, of course, but as I spoke it seemed to me that this old, disused expression had somehow gained a new meaning. About a month passed. On the night of the cremation, I sat as usual in my study. As the imperial coffin emerged from the palace, I heard the boom of the funeral cannon. To me it sounded the Meiji era's end. Later I read in the newspaper that it also signaled the end of General Nogi. 1. When my eyes fell on this news, I seized the paper and waved it at my wife. He died with his lord. I found myself exclaiming. There I read the letter that the general had written before he died. He had been longing all this time, he wrote, to die in expiation for his failure in the Satsuma Rebellion. 2. I paused to count on my fingers the years he must have lived with this resolution in his heart. 35 years had passed since the Satsuma Rebellion. By his own account, General Nogi had spent those 35 long years yearning to die without finding the moment to do so. Which had been more excruciating for him, I wondered, those 35 years of life, or the moment when he thrust the sword into his belly. 2 or 3 days later I finally decided to kill myself. I would guess that my reasons will be as hard for you to fully grasp as I found General Nogi's reasons to be. If so, it must simply be put down to the different eras we belong to, I think. Or perhaps, after all, our differences spring from the individual natures we were born with. At any rate, I have done my best in these pages to explain to you my own strange nature. I will be leaving my wife behind, but fortunately she will not want for the necessities of life. I do not want her to witness any horror. I intend to die in such a way that she will not have to see blood. I will leave the world quietly, without her knowing. I would like to have her believe that I died instantaneously. I would be content if she decided I had gone mad. It is now 10 days since I decided to die. You should know that I have spent most of that time writing this long memoir to leave for you. I was planning to see you again and tell you all this in person, but having written it, I am now glad I chose this method, since it has allowed me to describe myself more clearly to you. I have not written from mere personal whim. My past, which made me what I am, is an aspect of human experience that only I can describe. My effort to write as honestly as possible will not be in vain, I feel, since it will help both you and others who read it to understand humanity better. Just recently, I heard that Watanabe-Kazan chose to postpone his suicide for a week while he painted Kantan.3. Some will find this decision ridiculous, but no doubt his heart had its own reasons that made it imperative for him. This labor of mine is not simply a way of fulfilling my promise to you. It is for the greater part the result of a need I have felt within myself. But now I have answered that need. There is nothing left for me to do. When this letter reaches your hands, I will no longer be in this world. I will be long dead. 10 days ago my wife went to her aunt's place over in Ichigaya.